Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Luke had slept terribly, tangled in his sheets from tossing and turning, dipping in and out of nightmares about his father, Gus, and guns. It was a relief when the night ended, but he couldn't leave the flat until his door was fixed. He paced the living room with his hands on his head, trying to pull himself together. His usual strategies, running, kicking at the bag, meditating, reading, seemed laughable in the face of his current predicament. The idea of attending to tax law and economics was ludicrous, as though that life belonged to another person. Which it did. That was Luke Harris's life. He'd spent the morning fighting the remnants of Jack Quinlan. He changed his name legally when he was 18. A simple form at a government office divorced him from his past. The first time he'd used his new name aloud was in a backpacker hostel in Sydney, the day after he'd run away from Melbourne to be someone else. He was heating food in the hostel kitchen when a girl sidled up and asked his name. Luke, he told her, Luke Harris. He noted her lack of reaction. It was a normal name, unremarkable, unburdened with any past wrongdoing.
Tanya Scott is a writer, doctor and medical educator. With many years of experience working in mental health care, she's learned so much, not just about physical and mental health, but about humanity, resilience and the absurdity of life. Today I'm talking to Tanya Scott about her first novel, Stillwater. Tanya, welcome to the Good Reading podcast.
Hello, thanks for having me.
First novels often have a long and complicated history. Where did yours begin?
Oh, a long time ago. I think you're right. I think your first novel probably takes most of your life to write. So I started writing probably in primary school. I think the first story that I wrote was, about a dog called Spot. And I remember the teacher saying, yeah, this is a great story. And I think you get that little buzz of that, you can make up stories and people will enjoy reading them from a very young age. And in high school, I was obsessed with reading, of course. I was the nerdiest bookworm you'd ever meet. But I think we tend to put stuff on hold that's creative. And I think it's really common for people who are drawn to doing creative things to think they need to get a real job and, have a proper career and, really do what you're supposed to do as a productive citizen. So, and growing up, I didn't know anybody who was a writer. I didn't know anybody who, would sort of come out of the closet and say that they were interested in writing. So I didn't really see it as something that I could be doing. So I think, this first novel does have a very long gestation. I'd written a few very unfinished novels before this one. But I think really it started around the time of the COVID pandemic. We were going through quite a lot, we being the medical fraternity, I'm a GP, so we were very much blindsided by the pandemic. It was a very, very difficult time, and I did have a period of being quite burnt out from clinical medicine. And I was studying a certificate in professional writing and editing, which was a fantastic way to get back into writing because I had deadlines, which meant I had to finish things. And I think that's a real gift to a writer. Having a deadline that means that you have to actually complete a task and, write the end on things, which is something that when you're writing back in the closet, you don't tend to do as much. You tend to tinker around the edges of things forever.
You are a medical doctor with training and experience in mental health. What of that experience has found its way into Stillwater?
Yeah, look, I think, and I think most doctors would agree with this. I think once you've been working in medicine, it's very difficult to detach it from other parts of your life. It becomes really very much a personal and professional identity that you've always got this hat on of, thinking of people in, I think, this sort of health and humanistic way. I think with Stillwater in particular, there are some themes around mental health in Stillwater, and particularly about recovery from issues with mental health and about managing, after childhood adversity and after some traumatic events that have happened, and around how we can make a good recovery from those events happening. I think there's a lot of emphasis on on trauma as a theme, not so much in Stillwater, but just in the public perception at the moment. I think it's quite it's covered a lot in the media and in lots of fiction and non-fiction. But I think what we also need to focus on is some of those protective factors and some of the things that really help people to recover from adverse experiences. So particularly, having those really good role models in life, having support from schools, having connection in community, having, sporting outlets, so a lot of those sorts of things are really helpful for people, particularly young people, who may be at risk.
What is immediately apparent in Stillwater is that people are not what they seem. Your main character, Luke Harris, is not who he says he is. His alias, or perhaps his alter ego, Jack Quinlan, is apparently, and I quote, not buried as deep as he'd hoped. So who is the real Luke Harris?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, I think, who is the real Luke Harris? Because I think he is both. So, we're all really informed by our past. So the idea from Luke really started with a story that a patient told me, which was, I can't actually repeat the details because it'd probably be too identifying, but really about, this is a very, very normal middle class family, and the patient had told me some of the discussion about things that were going on at home and some of the background of some of the family members, and it was, really crazy stuff, and crazy being not a medical word, but, really very, very bizarre and unexpected from this family that on the surface just looked completely normal, so you're talking a couple of kids in a private school and, high level professional jobs, very well presented, very well groomed. And then and some of this discussion was about, some of the level of distress that can be going on under the surface of somebody's very thin veneer. And that's really where the idea for the character of Luke came from, was this idea that, everyone's got stuff going on behind. They've got past traumas, they've got unhealed wounds, everybody's got something that they that is maybe too vulnerable to show on the surface. So Luke definitely sits in that boat. So he has a lot of a background as Jack. So Jack was his name until he was 18. And really, most of Stillwater is a discussion of how that can come back and bite.
Luke is a very complex character. He has an imposing physical presence, but somehow quite handy in the kitchen. Along with other skills, he's calm in a crisis. He drives like an octogenarian, although he sports both visible and invisible scars.
Yeah, so he does have a few scars, and a lot of them are physical scars. So, he's had a pretty rough trot as a young person. So, lots of fights, a car crash or two. He's been through the mills physically. So he does have a few scars. The invisible scars are probably the more complex part, and that's really related to, some losses of family members, some traumatic events that have happened to him when he was a child. And those are ones that he probably keeps a lot more hidden. I mean, he does hide his physical scars. He doesn't like people looking at them, and he's very conscious of them. But he waits for people to ask, I think. But he does have a good set of skills, and I think that speaks to the different jobs that he's had over the course of his life. So he's had to look after himself a lot. And so he's a little bit obsessed with food, because I think he makes a comment at one point that his diet was 90% sausages until he was a teenager. So he has developed this real taste for fancy food. He likes food that's, a little bit more upmarket, and he likes to be able to cook for himself, and he does have a little bit of a theme of needing to do everything himself. That's not really good at accepting help from other people.
Yes, his culinary skills move from a toasted cheese sandwich to Wagyu beef fillet with pureed cauliflower.
Yeah, and charred broccolini and caramelized lemon. Yes, I may have been having a moment with the food because, most of the things that he eats are, would be on my favorite list.
Luke also has considerable fighting skills, but you certainly seem to know how to choreograph a good fight. Where did you pick that up?
That also is a great question. I think so. Fight choreography is a real is a real thing. It's a genuine occupation, and so I have family members who have been involved in martial arts, and particularly Chinese martial arts, and one of their instructors, sensei, does do fight choreography for movies. And although I didn't have a chance to pick his brains too much on this, that was where really the idea of the fight choreography came from. So my browser history is probably horribly incriminating in this as well. I have watched an awful lot of footage. The other thing for the writers out there listening is you do have to just get up and act stuff out, which is really entertaining and very embarrassing. And I'm really glad there's no security cameras in my study. But you do sometimes have to get up and actually physically act things out, because otherwise you end up with, there's an arm over there and there's a leg over there, and how do they meet? So sometimes it is really about the physically moving around. And I've seen some funny videos of fantasy writers doing sword fighting in their studies, and breaking things. But we don't have swords in this book, so I didn't have to worry about breaking things in my study.
With his new identity as Luke, things seem to be going his way, and he's clearly very capable of handling himself in any situation, socially, intellectually, physically. But even from the beginning, I couldn't help feeling that all this is about to end.
Yeah, I think that's the central point, I think, in Stillwater, is that he does want to take a new life. He wants to live. He has this idea of his own house and a steady job and a dog, and that's his real goal here, is to keep things as simple and unadventurous as possible, because, his life up until now has been, it's been pretty rocky, and he's been through a lot. So that's really what he's after. But obviously, there wouldn't be a story if he got it easily, would there? So he has to still face a few challenges to get there.
Luke is also studying accountancy, doing his best to keep a low profile. Is accountancy the ideal cover for someone like Luke?
Oh, look, I think it probably is. I think what he's looking for is sort of the opposite world of his father, in a way. His father was terrible with money, and he can't hold on to a cent. He either spends it on something, or he goes and gambles it, or and so he's from a very young age been very good with money, and been very, frugal, and really knowing, exactly where every cent is going. So it sort of does fit with his personality to be an accountant. He's good at money, but it's also, I think, a respectable, quiet, unassuming job, which is really where he wants to head. Is this almost invisible member of society that, nobody's going to come chasing him down with a gun, which is what he's really after.
There's a long list of challenges in Luke's life, and there's something in Luke which prevents him from just walking away from a situation. He can't seem to tolerate injustice, but situations that are also potentially life-threatening. Why can't Luke just walk away?
Yeah, he really can't walk away. He's someone who, because of some of the things that happened to him as a child, I think he has a very strong sense of looking after the underdog. And, he was an underdog, and he isn't really an underdog now, but, perhaps a bit of an anti-hero. But he really has a strong sense of justice, and he doesn't like to see people get away with things that they shouldn't get away with. And he does want to, I guess, protect the innocent, sometimes at expense of his own safety.
And into Luke's calm, quiet life, people from his past start to reappear. One of them is Gus Alberici, along with Armand Curry, who makes Gus look like a model citizen. And there are a number of other nasty characters in this story too.
Yeah, he does seem to pick up villains, doesn't he? So Gus he's like a role model, was like a role model for Luke as a teenager, and reappears in his life. And I think with writing villains, it's easy to make them all very bad. And what I was hoping with Gus is that we'd see him as a more complex than just a bad person. He's not just a bad guy. He's also, he's a father. He runs a hotel chain. He looks after his people. He probably has a dog that he pats, and that not every villain doesn't need to be just purely evil. I was thinking about this before. I was thinking about Dr. Evil in Austin Powers and how he has the cat that he strokes, and it's like, yeah, he's really, really evil, and he wants to be really evil, but he still loves his cat, and that human beings are not that simple. Even people who do awful, dreadful things sometimes, go home and kiss their wife and look after their kids. So humans are not purely good or bad. They really do have lots of grey areas and lots of moral ambiguity.
Luke is also working as a disability support worker just to get by, and that's where he meets Emma. Emma is a casting agent and aspiring actor, cast as Chantel in Streetwise, where she does her own stunts. But like Luke, she's learning to pretend, and Luke can't tell if she's acting or being genuine. But she also calls him the perfect chameleon. There's an interesting dynamic between them, particularly after Jonathan replays to Emma footage of Luke dealing with some intruders.
Yeah, so Luke meets Emma when he's called in as a respite carer. So he's trained as a disability support worker during the COVID pandemic because all of the work that he was doing previously had sort of dried up, all hospitality and all of that sort of stuff. And so Phil is Emma's brother, and Phil has a number of disabilities that Luke is helping out with in the home. And their dynamic is interesting because it's this kind of, Luke is in their house. And so he's very aware of everything that's going on with the family dynamics between Phil and Emma and their father, Jonathan. And Emma looks after Phil as well, quite a bit. Emma is a character she's a very privileged rich girl, and she has had this very mollycoddled kind of background where she's been very looked after. Her father's very protective of her, really wants her to, just basically to stay home and so he can keep an eye on her, even though she's in her 20s. But she is trying to break out of that by, her acting role she's taking on, where she's doing her own stunts and, going to the gun range, learning how to shoot. And she's doing this really in rebellion against her father, so she really does want to kind of, put a little bit of a middle finger up to her father in a lot of ways. At the same time, she's not really ready to leave that nest. She doesn't take on acting roles that she doesn't want because she doesn't have to financially. So she has this day job that she does working for a casting agent. So she's sort of in the biz, but she only takes acting roles that suit her or that suit her career path that she wants to take. So she's a very, very different person from Luke, and they are a little bit of an opposites attract in a way. And their dynamic is, it's very cautious and tentative to begin.
You've also written in a wonderful ensemble cast. We have the Wileys in Phil, Jonathan and Emma. We've got the Russian neighbour, Irina. There's Quinn, Luke's father, Kevin, Gail, Robbo. What are the challenges in assembling such a convincing motley crew without descending into caricature?
I think most of the characters really came quite fully formed. I didn't have to make them up. I think they're people that we all know in a lot of ways, and none of them are purely good or purely evil in any way. Like they're all a little bit ambiguous in, having some good traits and having some, perhaps some flaws, particularly the ones that we would think of as bad guys. They definitely have their flaws. All of them serve a role in Luke's life, and we're looking at most of these characters as the people who shaped Luke's life as a young person, or who he's sort of playing off now, and that he's dealing with at this point in his life, in his mid-20s. I think one of the ways to avoid caricature, I think, is really to really draw on people that you've met and people you know. And one of the advantages of working in general practice for longer than I'm prepared to admit is just meeting so many people. In a day in general practice, you can meet 20 or 30 people easily. Some GPs would meet a lot more than that, but I'm slow. And you talk to people and you understand, where they're at, and they tell you all sorts of things. It's a bit like a confessional in a doctor's room, some of the things you hear, and there's a cone of silence and they'll never come out. And so that's one way, I think, is just, basing it on, well, I've actually met somebody who was like this, and this was how they presented, and, this was how they dressed, and this was where their ambiguities lay. They were quite, ruthless in one part of their life, but actually quite loving in another, and, those sorts of aspects of their character.
I can't help but want to talk about his neighbour Irina. She's something of a mother figure, but she also keeps a safe in her room, a safe that belongs to Luke. What's in that safe that Luke can't keep in his own empty flat?
So Luke has got he's got a variety of hiding places, because he's kept things from his whole life. He's kept a collection of things, and we don't know what all of them are. And he doesn't want to keep them all in his flat because he knows that there's a chance his flat will be searched at any point. And because of his previous interactions with police and with lots of criminals, he doesn't really want to keep important things in his flat. So he has an arrangement with Irina, and he keeps his safe in the back of a mahogany cupboard that's hidden behind all of the clutter in her tiny flat.
Your biography tells me that you might often ponder the absurdity of life. How has that idea made its way into your fiction?
Yeah, absolutely. I think life is completely absurd, and I think the moment that we forget that life is absurd, we start to get depressed. I think this also probably comes from working in general practice, that you never know what is around the corner, and the things that actually happen in real life are so much more bizarre than anything that I could make up and write in a book. Some of the stories that I've heard from patients about, the way that people behave, just the random events that happen to them, and you think, well, that can't happen. That's not feasible, but it did, and so I think we do need to just keep this in mind. And there's a saying which comes from acceptance and commitment therapy, which is one of the types of counselling that I use, which is about holding things lightly. And we do need to hold on to everything very lightly, whether that's joy or sadness or anger or good things, bad things. The more we cling on to things, the more distress we'll feel when they change. Because everything is always changing, and we just don't know what's going to happen, and people get lulled into this false sense of that everything's going to stay the same, and they want to keep it the same, and it's just completely untrue. So life is very absurd, and the more patients you speak to, the more you realise that it is very difficult to anticipate what might happen next in your life.
Thank you, Tanya. You've made me feel like I've been to a really fulfilling and wonderful therapy session. Tanya, this is a great story, and thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Oh, thanks very much for having me. It's been fun.
I've been talking to Tanya Scott about her first novel, Stillwater. It's published by Allen & Unwin, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.